Welcome to IT Pro in the Know, the ITProTV webinar series. We'll be live tweeting during the webinar at #ProsKnow. Have a question? Use the GoToWebinar question box throughout the webinar and we'll answer as many as we can at the end. You'll receive a link to a recording of the webinar delivered to your inbox. Questions not answered during the webinar will be answered on Twitter with the #ProsKnow. Now let's get started.
Hello and welcome to IT Pro in the Know, the IT Pro TV webinar series brought to you live from the IT Pro TV studios. I'm your host, Wes Bryan, here with today's presenter, Mr. Don Pezet. That's right, Don Pezet is coming to us with more than 20 plus years experience in IT. And well, he's vendor certified, got many acronyms behind his name, like from Microsoft, Google, CompTIA, Cisco, and more. He is the IT Pro TV edutainer as well as the co-founder. You know, we've been mentioning IT Pro TV. What is IT Pro TV? Well, we call it binge-worthy IT learning because we offer, well, an engaging way to learn and grow your career. And it doesn't matter if you're a seasoned professional or maybe you're just getting started out in this industry. We've got all the courses to meet your needs, all online, all on demand, coming from a variety of vendors such as, well, CompTIA, Cisco, Microsoft, Apple, Linux, and a myriad of topics, including things like security, cloud, and more, all online, all on demand. So what do you say we go ahead and get started with today's topic? That's right, we're going to be talking about jumping clouds, or AWS to Azure. Please welcome to the stage, Mr. Don Pezet. Don, how you doing today, sir?
Hey, I am doing great, Wes. Thanks for having me on here, and
Absolutely.
Thank you all for tuning in today. We do have a pretty neat topic, right? For many, many years, Amazon has just dominated the cloud hosting market. Many organizations have already deployed in AWS, but now things are starting to change. We've got competition. Google Cloud is out there. Microsoft's Azure is out there. And in the case of Azure especially, they have grown to a point where many companies are reevaluating whether they should stay with AWS, or if you're newly deploying in the cloud, whether you should skip AWS altogether and go with Azure. Well, in this webinar, we're going to talk a little bit about the differences between the two and how we can kind of make the decision over whether jumping from one cloud to the other is the right decision for us and what some of the implications are going to be. What do we give up? What do we gain? What are the risks? That's all stuff that we've got coming up. Now, before we dive into all that, though, what I like to do is a little bit of a poll to kind of gauge where you, the audience, are at. I like to craft the webinar to be the most useful to everyone that's out there. So let's do just kind of a quick little Q&A here of what is your current cloud situation, so I can figure out where most of you are starting from. So you see the options on the screen. Please choose one of them. I'll read through them real quick. The first one is, hey, you're already using AWS, right? Many people are. You're deployed there, and that means you're entertaining the idea of moving away. Maybe you're already in Azure. That's a little bit different, right? Option 2, you're already in Azure. Maybe you're trying to make sure you made the right decision or just know, what am I missing by choosing Azure instead? Number 3, what if you use somebody else? There's plenty of other cloud providers that are out there. Some are really big, some are really small, but they all provide a very similar feature set. So if you're kind of out there in that realm. Number 4, you're not in the cloud. Plenty of people are still on-premises based or just running off of local systems. So you're looking at the cloud as being a potential option or looking for a way to make sure you're right in not going to the cloud. And then lastly, number 5, hey, no preference one way or another. I'm just here to learn and see what happens, right? So choose your options. I think, Wes, everybody's probably had enough time to register in a vote there. So let's see what is our result.
Absolutely. So I'm going to go ahead and cast my vote. I think I'm just here to learn. This is an interesting one because I've had the pleasure of being a part of a few of these webinars. It's all over the board here. So we've got 20% in 3 different categories. 24% are saying no cloud preference. I'm just here to learn. We also have a 24% that says my organization is currently using AWS, and then sitting out there in the background, we've got about 19% that are using Azure.
Okay, excellent. Well, I mean, if you look at those numbers, right, 19% in Azure and was it 24% in AWS?
That's right. Yes,
right there, that tells you that almost half the people watching this podcast have already deployed in the cloud. And look at the split there. AWS is not dominating this audience, right? Where we've got 19 versus 24% is not, that's a 5% difference between the two. That's not that significant of a lead. And when you read on the media and stuff, it's very easy to start looking at it and saying, wait a minute, AWS is the market leader. That's who I have to go with. Well, if you're using somebody else, you are not alone. Plenty of people are. All right, so let's take that information and take a look at some of the different implications we have by switching from one provider to another. All right. I want to start with what I think is the most important one, and then we'll get to what everybody else thinks is important. But what I think is the most important are services, right? When you're running AWS, they have a ton of services available. And when you run Microsoft Azure, you have a ton of services available. And when you flip from one to another, some of those services aren't there. Well, when you pull up their web pages, here on the left, I have a screenshot of the Azure Solutions page, and on the right, I've got a screenshot of the AWS Platform page. And there are tons and tons of services. And if it looks small here on my screen, that's because it's small in real life. If you ever get bored, jump over and pull up their page. In fact, I've got their page kind of stashed away here in the background. As you navigate through, you'll see where they list just tons and tons of different things that they do. The Amazon one is really packed because each of these things that you highlight has a number of services nested beneath it. And there, I'm just in the first row. As I start moving down, we've got desktop streaming, management tools, and so on. There is a ton of stuff available when we're using a cloud service like this. However, they don't match up. And when you look at AWS, they have over 70 different services. And when you look at Azure, they have over 40 different services. That's 30 things that I'm missing if I go with Azure. But there's that old saying, I forget what it's attributed to, like 80% of the people only use 20% of the features or whatever. Well, that's true. Most people don't care about all these extra fringe things. Like a moment ago, I clicked on the AWS, the virtual reality services. I've never used those. I have no intent on using those. So what do I care if Azure has those or if AWS has those? Doesn't matter. Core services are what's important. And when we start comparing the core services, we'll actually find that the different systems match up pretty well. They might have a different name, but the functionality is there. So for example, virtual machines. I need to bring up a server. All right, well in AWS, I spin up an EC2 instance. We've got the Elastic Compute Cloud. In Azure, we spin up an Azure VM or a virtual machine. We fire it up. Same basic thing at the end of the day, right? Just a different name. Databases, we've got Azure Database versus Amazon RDS. Networking, you got VPCs versus virtual networks. DNS, you got Route 53 versus Azure DNS. They all just match up. They just have a different name. So our first earth-shattering ramification of moving from one cloud provider to another is learning a few different names, right? Maybe a slightly different interface. But the core functionality that's required for you to create a highly available, robust web application that's deployed globally, it's all there, right? And you can do the same with either provider. If I went to work somewhere today, I'm an AWS guy. I'll admit that right here. I prefer Amazon AWS. But if I went to work somewhere today and they said, we're an Azure environment, I wouldn't be angry about it. I can do everything I need to do. I just have to learn some slightly different commands. It's not that big of a deal from the service perspective, right? So I wouldn't fixate on that. Instead, there's plenty of other things we can fixate on. And these are the things that a lot of people think of first. I think of services first because I'm a sysadmin. I'm a network admin. That's where I come from. I'm like, I need stuff to work. I don't really worry about things like how much it costs, right? But if you're an accountant or a CIO or a leader, a manager of any kind of sort, you kind of do care about pricing. And these are the areas where we really start to see the difference between Azure and AWS and the different offerings that are out there. The pricing can be significantly different as we move from one provider to another. So let's talk a little bit about that. Now, I'm going to show a couple of tables here. I was going to show the web pages originally, but I had two problems. One problem is all the text is really small, so it's hard to see. Second problem is they change very frequently, which is frustrating to keep up with. But I want to mention that here because I'm going to show you pricing that as of this second, well, wait a minute, as of 11 p.m. last night, these numbers were accurate. But even today, the numbers could be different. So always verify. Don't build your budget off of my slides, please. I think everybody's responsible enough not to do that. But anyhow, when we fire up something, like a AWS instance, right? I need a virtual machine. I mentioned how in AWS we have EC2 instances, and Azure we have Azure VMs. So what does that cost? Well, we have different names, but we have the same basic idea. In AWS, I might fire up an instance called an M5 large, right? That is a general purpose virtual machine, has 2 CPUs and 8 gigs of RAM. In Microsoft land, I can fire up a general purpose virtual machine. They call it a D2, and it's up to version 3 now. That M5, that's actually like the 5th version of the multi-purpose machines, M5. So the D2 version 3, 2 CPUs, 8 gigs of RAM. All right. Now, I picked this with Windows Server on it, right? Windows Server running as the operating system, and you can see on that pricing, there's a pretty big difference there. On AWS, it's going to cost me almost 19 cents per hour, right? Which doesn't sound like a lot. 19 cents isn't a big deal. On Azure, 37.5, almost 38 cents an hour. That's almost double the price. That virtual machine is going to cost me twice as much. That's a pretty significant difference.
You know, Don, I'm sure we could probably guess, or I could take a guess as to why the price might be different, but I'm just going to take a guess. Is that because, well, I know Azure's making massive strides in this industry. Is it maybe because AWS is a little bit more mature and have been around for a little bit longer? You think that might have something to do with the price difference?
So there's certainly economies of scale,
sure,
right? Amazon has been at this significantly longer than Microsoft. Microsoft has really done a great job of heavily investing in Azure, creating data centers and trying to draw up that customer base. And as they get more customers, their price goes down. Remember how I mentioned prices change very, very frequently? They're almost always going down. It's not like other things, like my Netflix subscription gets more and more expensive every year while the video library gets smaller. We could do a whole webinar on me complaining about that. But in cloud services like these, as Amazon gets more customers, as Azure gets more customers and more deployments, the cost goes down every year. It gets cheaper and cheaper. Now, I was always surprised by this number because I assumed if I spun up a Windows machine in Azure, it would be cheaper than in AWS because Microsoft owns Microsoft Windows. So the licensing and all that should be lower cost for them. Versus with AWS, Amazon doesn't own Windows. They have to pay a Microsoft license while that machine is running on top of their own costs, right? So I figured it would be a little different than this. And that's why I wanted to bring this up on a slide to show you guys you actually don't get that giant savings there with Windows. Now, I'll also tell you that we don't, or at least I don't, really deploy Windows virtual machines in the cloud anymore. And in fact, a lot of people don't. You'll find that when we develop web applications these days, Linux is kind of the de facto platform. So let's take a look at what this would look like with Linux virtual machines. Notice the price goes down significantly. The main reason there is the operating system license is gone, right? The Linux is free. And I should qualify this, right? Because if you do Red Hat Enterprise Linux, there is a license. You do have to pay. But if you do Ubuntu or Debian, if you do, CentOS, they're free. And all of a sudden, the AWS license, this is the same virtual machine, right? Same on both sides, just a different operating system. On AWS, we dropped from 19 cents an hour down to about 10 cents an hour. And on Azure, we dropped from 38 cents an hour down to about 19 to 20 cents an hour. It's basically half. I mean, we're dropping significantly in the price by cutting out that operating system license. But even with the operating system license out of the way, the Azure virtual machine is still more expensive. So Azure is going to cost you a little more money in the long run. All right. Is that a bad thing? Depends, right? A Mercedes costs more than a Hyundai. Is that a bad thing? Well, there's some pretty big differences between them. Now, I will say, AWS to Azure is not comparing Mercedes to Hyundai. They are very, very equal. It's more like comparing Toyota to Nissan, I guess. It's not that different. But that is a significant thing we need to be aware of. And it's not just virtual machines that are this way. Even storage is going to be more expensive, but it's much closer, right? And when we look here at AWS versus Azure, on the left, I've got S3 standard storage, and on the right, I've got Azure Block Blob storage. Crazy names, but effectively the same thing. And when you look at the pricing that's on these, basically, these are almost identical. And the difference is almost negligible. For the first 50 terabytes, they're both about 2.5 cents per gigabyte, right? 0.023. When you start getting into the next 450 terabytes, the next 500 terabytes, the difference is 0.0001 cents per gigabyte. I mean, it is really, really small. So Azure comes in just a hair more expensive. In this case, I would call it a wash. And when it comes to storage, storing data in Azure, storing data in AWS are effectively priced the same. And just full disclosure here, usually when I store things in the cloud, I store them in both. And that's because this whole world of hybrid clouds and using more than one cloud provider is a very realistic thing, a very important thing, because if one provider goes down, you want to have data somewhere else. So there are certain areas where that pricing is very, very similar. But it is something we need to think about. And if you're an IT leader, is probably one of the top issues that you consider, or at least concern yourself with. All right, let's talk about hybrid cloud. All right, what is hybrid cloud? That is the ability for you to connect your on-premises data center with a cloud data center. All right, now, for most people, you've already got an on-premises data center and you're migrating into the cloud. There's very few companies that are 100% in the cloud. There are some, ITProTV, we are, our systems are 100% in the cloud, but our company's 5 years old, right? If you work for a company that is 10 years old, then they're definitely not going to be 100% in the cloud. It is too much infrastructure gets deployed locally. So many of the cloud providers out there are working to help connect your on-premises environment with your cloud environment. AWS has some functionality for this. Obviously, from a bottom line perspective, they don't want you to have an on-premises deployment. They want you to have everything in the cloud. That's how they make money, right? That's where they want it. But they recognize that some workloads cannot be put in the cloud. Maybe there's regulatory compliance or other reasons, and that's why it's not up there in the cloud. But there are times where we need it. In the case of AWS, they partnered with VMware. And so they have an alliance. It's called the VMware and AWS Alliance, not a very creative name, but it allows you to have VMware vSphere deployed locally and connect it up to your AWS environment. And you can do some super cool stuff. I can have a virtual machine running on top of ESX, and I can do a migration, not a live migration, but you power it down and do a migrate and send it right up into AWS. And I can do the reverse as well. I might have an AWS AMI and an Amazon Machine Image, and I can then deploy that to a virtual machine running on premises. I can have storage that's linked in between my cloud and my on-premises environment. It's pretty neat, but it's not actually Amazon doing the heavy lifting here. It's actually VMware doing the heavy lifting. They've got that available, right? But this is one area where I will say there's no contest. Microsoft has hands down done a better job of supporting the hybrid cloud. And there were numerous announcements that came out of MS Ignite this year, just last month, 2 months ago, about their hybrid cloud technologies and doing their hyper-converged networks and all of that. But this is a diagram that Microsoft published back in 2014, 4 years ago. This has been in the works for a long time. And what they did is they released a software suite called the Windows Azure Pack. And what the Azure Pack allowed you to do was to manage your cloud services alongside your on-prem services. So if I had a SQL server that was an Azure SQL server, and I had an on-prem SQL server, I could connect the two and use one management tool to be able to manage and control them both, and it worked great. Well, Azure Pack was really just the first step, and that evolved last year with something new called Azure Stack. And what Azure Stack allows you to do is to actually have hardware on premise that's running the Azure Stack that looks exactly like an Azure region. You look like an Azure data center. And when you manage it, you see your data center, your region, right alongside all of the other regions that Microsoft hosts. And you're able to move resources between them. You can set up fault domains. You can set up all the various things that you want. And it's all seamless. And so now your on-premises deployment and your Azure deployment look the same. It's just another region to you. And it's really, really cool. They've done a phenomenal job with this.
Don, do you find that this is a commonality, is just the hybrid model in general because of those businesses that have been around for a while?
Yeah, I think in the early days, companies like Amazon were just hoping people would move entirely into the cloud and be done with it. And what Microsoft did a little different here is they said, people aren't going 100% in the cloud and people are nervous about it. Let's give them a middle step. And that's turned out to be a winning formula for them. It's really cool. If you're already leveraging Azure, maybe you're using this, maybe not. If you're just using AWS, you might not be aware that this stuff is available. It's really cool. You should definitely check it out. It's a super easy way to start getting kind of indoctrinated into that cloud space. You take baby steps and move into the cloud. So really cool. Definitely Microsoft kind of leading on that edge right there. It's just really impressive, the work that they've done there. And this is all part of what Satya Nadella has been pushing to kind of create a open, easier to use, less locked in type environment. And with this stuff, you're still able to keep your local resources and combine them with cloud. It's a neat solution.
Yeah, one of the things that I'd seen in an interview of him saying that that's what they're doing is they're trying to break those silos, bring down those verticals. So interesting that we're seeing that reflected today.
Yep. Now, I mentioned with Azure Stack, you're effectively creating a new region, right? Let's talk about regions. That's part of the infrastructure that's behind each of these. Amazon has been at this a long time. They have massive state-of-the-art data centers with some of the most talented network and systems engineers in the entire world. When they hire a database administrator, they're not just scrambling to find somebody. They're looking for the best, and they've got the money to do it. It's just a phenomenal group of people. They've got infrastructure that's been built up over a decade now. They really know what's going on. Well, Microsoft has been competing against that too. And you'll hear people say, yeah, Azure's just not as big as AWS yet. And so, with AWS, we get a little more stability, or I trust the data centers more. Well, what does that actually look like, right? Is that true or not? Well, when you look at AWS, AWS has a number of regions spread around the world, okay? I believe the number is 18. Yes, 18 regions. 18 regions spread around the world, okay? That's a lot of regions. Each region, think of these as effectively data centers, right? So I have 18 different places I can deploy. Do I have customers in France? Great. I can deploy resources right there in France, and we're nearby. Or there's Ireland, there's the eastern side of the US, the western side of the US. We've got regions all over the places, 18 of them, right? Azure has 54 different geographic regions. These are servers all over the place, okay? Looking at that, boy, does it look like Microsoft is killing it. That's a lot of data centers. But let's talk about why this isn't necessarily accurate. Because inside of each region, you have what are called availability zones. And an availability zone is actually its own isolated, separate data center. If I go back to Amazon's diagram here, notice how each of the regions has a number inside of it. Like if you look at North Virginia on the eastern side of the United States, there's one with a 6 in it. There are 6 completely independent data centers all there in North Virginia. Now, if North Virginia gets hit by a hurricane, all 6 of those data centers go away, right? So that's a problem. But they've got more of these regions all over, 18 regions. And if you look, most of them have, on average, most of them have 3 availability zones inside of each. That's a lot. Microsoft is not like that. It's hard to see from this diagram. There's 54 regions, but very few of them have more than one availability zone. Most of them are a single availability zone. And that makes it hard to compare based on this. So I did a little math for us before the show. And all this is information that I've pulled directly from Microsoft. I've cited where I got the information from. Amazon has 18 regions with 55 availability zones. Microsoft Azure has 54 regions, but they've only got 15 availability zones altogether throughout the entire environment. That means most of their regions, at least 39 of their regions, only have one availability zone. So at the end of the day, guess what? They both have an almost identical amount of data centers. So don't think that one has more data centers than another. Now, not every data center is created equal. And when we go back to a diagram like this, if I have 6 all in North Virginia, those are pretty close together. So what do I care? If Microsoft has spread those out, well, that may actually work better for me, that if they're spread out a little more, we may get a little more resiliency and redundancy as a result because of that. Maybe there's like a fault line, right? Different tectonic plates, and you might be in the same state. They might both be in California, but on 2 different sides of the fault line. That can be helpful, right? So keep that in mind. But from an infrastructure standpoint, Amazon had a huge lead, a lead of over a decade, and they really did dominate the market. Microsoft has dumped so much funding and resources and dedicated so much effort into building up Azure that they've caught up, right? But it really is about equal. So if you're debating, should I go with Azure? Should I go with AWS? If I'm on Azure, should I switch? If I'm on AWS, should I switch? Infrastructure is not likely to be one of your bigger concerns. They're both pretty much equal in that standpoint. All right, let's talk about another one. We mentioned Satya Nadella and some of the things that he's been doing with Microsoft, Linux support. I said earlier that most of the virtual machines we deploy are going to be Linux-based, right? The web applications are Linux-based. And so you would think, boy, Microsoft's not going to be too keen on Linux. Well, AWS is, right? Amazon, they're really friendly with Linux. If I go into the Amazon world and I go to deploy, I can pick from CentOS, Debian, Kali Linux, Red Hat, SUSE, Ubuntu. They even have Amazon Linux, which is based off of CentOS, which is based off of Red Hat, it's the extended Linux family. But they have their own version of Linux that they maintain themselves, right? Because Amazon doesn't really have an OS other than that, right? So you have a lot of choices, and the majority of virtual machines, the majority of EC2 instances are running Linux inside of AWS. But Microsoft has come a long way, and they actually have a number of different options as well. So here's the help documentation for Azure, and you'll see where they support CentOS, Debian, Oracle Linux, Red Hat Enterprise Linux, SUSE Linux, and so on, right? Pretty much the same. They don't support Amazon Linux, which is odd, but they do support all of these other ones as well. You can deploy that. And really interesting statistic, last year, Microsoft tweeted out that 40% of the virtual machines in Azure were actually running Linux. Well, at Ignite last month, they didn't tweet this out, but they said it at the conference, 51% of the virtual machines running in Azure are now running Linux. Microsoft isn't just tolerating it, they're directly supporting it. So if you have a Linux-based web application, you're perfectly fine deploying in Microsoft. You don't even have to have a single Windows instance. You can do everything in Linux, and it's fully supported. They've got that direct support in there. It's really impressive stuff.
Don, I know that a lot of enterprises out there, they have enterprise-level Windows environments, right? Where's the support for that? Do we have support for like directories and stuff?
We do, and actually, hang on, there we go. Oh. I've got a slide for that. So basically, when we talk about operating systems, right, Linux is open source, it's free, well, mostly free, depending on which one you run. Windows you pay for, right? But Windows has a lot of services that are really useful. Probably the most important one is the Active Directory. If we want to do unified authentication, right, or identity management, Microsoft's Active Directory is great for that. A lot of enterprises use it. Now, if I'm deploying in AWS, they actually do have the Amazon Directory services, or I can just deploy a Windows virtual machine and run Active Directory inside of Windows like that. It's not as ideal, but I can. But in the Azure world, because Microsoft developed all of this, well, they have full support for not just running your Active Directory on Azure, but actually running what's called Azure Active Directory, where they fully manage all the replication and the backups. It's a fully managed directory service, and all of the services inside of Azure can authenticate using credentials stored inside of your Azure Active Directory. So if you rely on the Active Directory for your identity and authentication, Azure is going to be a better solution for you there. That's an area where they win because it is just so well integrated into their product. That's very different for Amazon. They offer the directory, but then they have a whole separate set of authentication called the AWS IAM, or Identity and Authentication Management. And IAM has its own set of credentials that you manage. So now you've got these two different sets of identities, one inside a resource and one outside of the resource for management. That makes it a little bit more difficult. So handling things like that in AWS, we've got to do a little more planning and a little more thought. They do have a managed Active Directory offering, but it's just not integrated throughout all of their products. Most of their products are Linux-based, and they don't directly support authenticating SCAD without significant alteration by our part. On the Microsoft side, they've built it into everything they do. So this is certainly a big area where AWS is I'm gonna say it's an area where they're behind. They have other solutions. This is if I specifically need Active Directory that AWS is behind. All right, the last thing I want to mention is automation. And I really should have called this one like automation and tools, right? When you're working with Azure, when you're working with AWS, scalability is one of the biggest benefits. If I want to spin up 100 servers, I can, and I can do it really quick. Well, we do a lot of that through command line tools. And in Azure, you have the PowerShell, the Windows PowerShell that you can use, and the various PowerShell commandlets that work with Azure, and you can manage your machines with that. In AWS, you have the AWS CLI, command line interface that you can install and use and manage it. Both are about equal as far as their power, but totally different syntax. So moving from one cloud to another cloud is going to mean there's a pretty big re-education period. You have to relearn, retrain all the different commands and things that you have to issue. That's a big obstacle. And I know there's many people who don't want to move from one system to another because it would be a nightmare, not just to learn, but to rewrite all your scripts, all of your other utilities and things that you use, any kind of automations that you put in place can be really challenging moving from one to another. For example, a load balancer in Azure is configured completely different than an ALB over in AWS. They do the same thing, but they're configured completely different. It's a challenge, right? You have resource groups in Azure; those don't exist in AWS, and so now your configurations are really kind of confusing. So that's something to be aware of. Many people use automation suites instead of actually trying to do things by hand. In AWS, they actually have support for a number of different automation suites. You have CloudFormation, which is Amazon specific. You have OpsWorks, which is really a hosted version of Puppet or Chef, which are two very, very popular automation suites. You also have the System Manager. And so you might already be using Puppet or Chef on premise. And if that's the case, you can take your runbooks and throw them right up here into OpsWorks, and you can be up and running in a matter of no time. Really, really cool and really easy. On the Microsoft side, you have Azure Automation, and that's it. And if you want to do anything else, you've got to bring up Azure Virtual Machines and run whatever your automation platform is right there and use that to do the automation. So it's not fully managed. Something like AWS's OpsWorks, it's a fully managed Puppet environment. I know I mentioned in some of the shows, if you guys have watched my shows, I love Puppet. I think it's a great product, but setting up a Puppet master, the control server, it's a nightmare. It's really, really hard. In OpsWorks, you just click some buttons and it's done. So Amazon is a little more forward on that. So if you have lots of automation in place, AWS is usually the friendlier environment for that. Getting it moved over to Azure is possible, but it is a lot of work. You are going to be rewriting a lot of stuff, and the targets are different and so on. So it is just going to be a lot of effort. Definitely something to keep in mind right there. All right, well, I've run through a number of different areas trying to highlight what the changes are that we have as we move from one cloud provider to another. You'll notice a kind of a common theme. On a lot of them, pretty much equal, right? The services that are offered, the infrastructure that's in place, the operating system support, it's pretty much the same between them. The areas where we have differences, there's cost. Azure is more expensive. So if you go with Azure, you're going to be paying more. There's tooling, right? There's a different set of tools for Azure than AWS that you have to overcome. Those are some big differences. But after that, they're largely the same. So the risk of moving from one provider to another is actually really minimal. If you've chosen AWS and you're wondering if you chose wrong and you should look at Azure, well, certainly look at Azure, but don't feel like you chose wrong. You're in great shape. If you chose Azure and you feel like maybe you should have gone with AWS, don't feel bad. You made a good choice. It works, right? You might want to save some money, in which case you shift some resources off, but otherwise you're in good shape. And if you're not going with either, well, know that as you make your decision, there's not a huge lot of risk of making the wrong decision on picking a provider here. These two have equaled up really, really well. And I'm excited to see the next couple of years because Microsoft is continuing to advance. Amazon is continuing to advance. I'm curious to see if one of them pulls ahead.
All right, Don, a lot of great information here. What do you say? We got time for some questions here? We got some questions coming in here. In fact, we got one right now from Mohammed from New Jersey that asks, a great question too, are the same VPNs types supported in Azure and AWS?
Yes and no. So the most popular VPN types, yes. There are some fringe ones, like Microsoft Azure has some support for SSTP, which nobody uses, but they have it. So it's there if you do use it, then maybe that's cool. But your standard ones, most people are just building up an IPsec tunnel. And you'll find that you can build up an IPsec tunnel to Azure about the same way as AWS. Now, where it is different is the routing protocols, right? With Azure, they prefer you to do static routes to be able to move data between your on-prem and your cloud environment. With AWS, for the longest time, they were pushing BGP. That meant you had to use the border gateway protocol to handle routing in between your on-prem and this cloud environment. And that was a big headache for a lot of developers and just sysadmins, netadmins. Amazon has been backing off that lately and making it a little bit easier to connect that and cleaning it up. But that has been a headache point for a number of years. But by and large, if you stick with IPsec, you'll have the same basic connectivity between both products.
All right. Thanks, Mohammed, for that question. Now we got another one coming up. Juan in New York says, Don, you mentioned that you prefer AWS. He asked, why is that your choice?
So a couple of different reasons, right? a big reason is that I've worked in it for a long, long time. So I have a certain comfort level. I know I can do things quickly and reliably. A second reason is cost. It's cheaper, right? So that's easier to make the argument for any leadership. If you say like, we could buy a server for $4,000, or I could have a virtual server in AWS for $120 a month, and the break even is years out, right? Before you'd benefit from having an on-prem system. It's easier to make that argument than if it was more expensive, right? And then the other thing is just something that's a little bit on the personal side. Microsoft has been dumping money and resources into Azure really, really fast. They've grown really fast over the last few years. Azure, even 2 years ago, was very different than it is today. That's a lot of change. It's changing fast. It's hard to keep up with. AWS has been a little more consistent. So a lot of the commands and tools and processes I used for doing things 5 years ago are actually done the same today in AWS, whereas very few things that I did in Azure 5 years ago are done the same way today. So that's kind of why I fall into that area, and a lot of it comes down to experience.
All right, that was a great question. We got another question coming in here for you, Don. Got a lot of great questions here for you. Lauren in Salt Lake City asks, do you think eventually companies will legacy on-prem servers, or let me try that again. Do you think eventually companies with legacy on-prem servers will be all 100% in the cloud?
Probably. Now, I would have said yes a year ago,
sure,
right? But regulatory compliance has really changed over the last few years, and things like GDPR, and I mean, we already had HIPAA compliance and stuff. There are many organizations that have data sets that just cannot go in the cloud. And if you've got data that can't go in the cloud, you don't have a choice. You've got to have on-prem. Now, Amazon and Microsoft both have, I'm going to call them secret data centers. In fact, on one of my slides, you might have noticed there's a little bullet point on like the Azure one where it says there's 2 secret government ones where they don't tell you where they are. But if you work for the US government, you have access to those data centers. And so now you can take that data that you wouldn't normally be able to put in the cloud, and you can put it there in their GovCloud or whatever it's called. So, in that scenario, yes, it makes sense for people to go 100% in the cloud. I'll tell you here in our building, right? With ITProTV, we are 100% in the cloud. It's nice to know that if a hurricane blows through and tears this building down, our website stays up, the customers don't notice. That's a great experience, right? Well, not for us, right? But for the customer. But what if our internet connection goes down? Now, all the employees here can't work. So if you're a service organization, it's really nice if you are in the cloud. But if you're a hospital or some kind of place where you have a lot of on-premises workers, an on-prem data center is still going to get you better performance. So I don't see on-premises data centers going away anymore. I think they're going to stay. And this new push for hybridization is going to make it easier to share workloads in between the two. So on-premises data centers will likely get smaller over the next few years, but I don't think we're going to see them go away.
All right. Thank you for that question coming out of Salt Lake City. All right. We got another one for you, Don, here. Walter in North Carolina asks, says, I've heard some poor customer experience from AWS Route 53. Looks like we're talking DNS. And is the Azure DNS a better solution? And can you use both? So kind of a two-part.
Sure. So, all right. It's kind of a tricky one. I'm going to go different because I love Route 53. I think it's great. It's one of the few fully standards-based DNS services that are out there, and there's so many really cool things baked into it. And it even has some extensions that work great with AWS as far as like aliases and so on. But it has had some issues over the years. Azure DNS has as well. Azure DNS is built on top of the Windows DNS server. They've got it deployed at scale. Most of what you can do inside of Route 53, you can also do inside of Azure DNS. So they're pretty close on parity. You can use both, but it's a bad idea to use both. When you have a domain, you have to, on the registrar, you have to tell it where the start of authority is. And if you have multiple starts of authority, one in AWS and one in Azure DNS like that, in theory, people will get sent different places, but you can end up with inconsistent systems. And it's not, like DNS is not really designed to be done that way. So ideally, you're going to pick one or the other, right? So the answer is, while you could do both, I wouldn't recommend it.
All right. So, and thank you for that. Coming out of North Carolina. Got another one here for you, Don. Pablo asks, do you see customers doing multi-cloud, for example, IaaS and Amazon, and let's see, analytics in Azure, or do customers tend to stay into a single cloud?
Most people are in a single cloud right now. And I think that's about to change. I think people are recognizing there have been some horror stories out lately, right? You'll hear about a company, there was one a few months ago where an employee violated the terms of service of Google Cloud and Google shut their account down. Well, one employee did something bad. The entire company got shut down. They weren't able to work. They had 100 employees sitting there twiddling their thumbs and customers who couldn't access resources. And what do you do when your entire cloud environment gets shut down? Maybe it's not malicious. Maybe it's an accident, like a data center goes down and now your services are offline, right? Well, if you deploy across more than one cloud vendor, now you have a little bit of resilience, right? And it's very, very difficult to have a live application running on two different cloud providers. Like just synchronizing a SQL database is really hard, or MySQL or whatever, in between cloud providers is very challenging. But to have a hot production environment running in one cloud and a standby in another cloud where you have all of your critical servers replicated over, that's actually pretty easy to set up. And if it's a cold standby where the servers aren't even running, you're just paying storage. And storage in the cloud is cheap. Being set up that way means if something goes wrong with one cloud provider, you can flip up the other. And going back to my DNS comment, if I have my start of authorities set for Amazon and Amazon goes down, or I just get mad at Amazon, I can change those start of authorities, point them over to Azure, and now I'm flipped over in that Azure environment running over there. And if your time to lives are nice and small, set them to 3 minutes, 5 minutes, your entire customer base can be flipped over to a whole new cloud provider in under 5 minutes. That type of stuff is very easy to build in the cloud. That's really hard on premises because I would have to buy another premises, right? I'd have to buy another building somewhere else, and flipping people that way becomes really, really challenging supporting it. Cloud makes it easy. So if you haven't looked into multi-cloud yet, you really should. Why pick just Azure or just AWS? You can do both, right? And you just get billed for what you use. So it's not like you're in some crazy long-term contract. It's easy to manage.
All right, very good. So we've got another question coming in from our neighbors to the north. Jose from Montreal says, how do you compare, or how do they compare price-wise when it comes to traffic load? Do they have similar models?
They do have similar models. I don't have the numbers in front of me. Both of them, they don't bill you for data going in. They bill you for data going out. So that's kind of a neat process because if let's say I'm just using the cloud service as a backup provider, right? So I'm dumping my backups into Azure Blob Storage, or I'm dumping it into AWS S3. They don't bill me a dime for sending the data in. I pay for the data storage at rest, which I show those numbers on the slide. And then they bill you when you get the data out, when you retrieve it. If it's a web server, this would be when visitors hit your page. But if it's backups, it'd be when you download them. The pricing on that is actually very similar. It does vary based on the region, though. Actually, I should have mentioned that earlier. A lot of the pricing varies based on the regions, the instances you fire up, and so on from region to region. Some of the data centers, like the ones in China, are usually a lot more expensive because those data centers are more difficult for them to run. Versus the ones that are here in the US, which are usually the cheapest. So those are all things that influence it, but the network bandwidth is something you pay for, so definitely pull those numbers up.
We got a pretty highly educated set of viewers here because we got another great question coming in. Dazuki asks, and I hope you got your name right, Dazuki asked, would there be any benefit to using Azure instead of AWS if a company is using Office 365 and on-prem AD?
So Office 365 is a really compelling argument to use Azure, mainly because of Azure AD, because of the Active Directory, that you can federate the Active Directory between Office 365 and your on-prem AD, or you might even be synchronizing already, right? There's the Office 365 Active Directory Connector, I think is what it's called, where you're able to sync up all your user accounts into the AD. But if you set up a federation, then you're effectively linking your on-prem AD with Office 365, and it makes it so much easier to issue out permissions and access to things like SharePoint sites and other things that are inside of it, and it really is very, very handy. You don't have any of that with AWS. On the AWS side, you would have to stand up your own systems and manage it that way. It's far more complex. So it is a very compelling argument to do that.
All right, last question here, and I'll go ahead and give you a heads up on the topic. This is going to be about GDPR or GPDR. Maybe I got that with that acronym right. This is coming from Jeremy in Texas. It says, can you go into more detail why GDPR data needs to be on-prem?
So basically, what a lot of the rules state in there, and it also depends on where you are. Like technically, if you're in the U.S. and all of your customers are in the U.S., then you don't care about GDPR at all. It's not your problem, right? But even if you're in the US, if you have customers all over the world and some of those customers happen to be in Europe, all of a sudden you've got a challenge, right? That according to the rules, a customer's data needs to be stored in the EU if they're an EU citizen, right? The idea there is that, let's say I have a database with a bunch of personal information for people that are EU citizens. Well, we're a US company. The US government could come and force me to turn that over. The US government could force me to give EU citizen data to the government, and the EU would not have a way to stop that because I'm a US company, I'm using US servers. But if my servers were in the EU, now the EU hierarchy could step in and say, nope, you can't disclose that. It's locked off. It's over here. So that's part of the clause there. So if you've got customers in the EU and you've got customer data, you're supposed to be hosting it over there. Now, with cloud solutions, that makes life easier because you can say, you know what? There's a region right over there, and there's one in Paris, there's one in Ireland, there's one in numerous places over there. So now I don't have to go and buy a building and put servers over there. I can just shard my database based on region and stick that data over in the EU, and now it's separated and isolated, right? But if you have a database that can't be sharded, or you have data that is like HIPAA, right? With HIPAA compliance, you have medical records that you can't share without the patient's permission. Well, technically, if you take that data and put it in Azure, you're sharing it with Microsoft. If you put it in AWS, you're sharing it with Amazon, and you're doing it without the customer's permission, right? And we know that the Microsoft employees don't have access to your data, and we know the Amazon employees don't, but they could, right? You get the rogue employee every now and then. And so there's many, many places, especially in the world of law enforcement, where they say, you know what? We're just going to keep that data on premises. We don't have to worry about rogue employees. We have our own employees that manage it, and now you have complete and total control of the data. That's a hard argument to overcome. No matter how much you love the cloud, there's times where that data just needs to stay on premises.
All right, Don, thanks for thanks for all the answers there. And we do appreciate you having the questions out there. And we have an offer for you here that we'd like to tell you about. If you like what you saw here today, you might want to take a look at a ITProTV membership. You can check out a free membership, no credit card required, with access to select courses and our daily live feed. You can also get a full personal membership that provides complete access to the course library with or without practice exams and virtual labs. And if you're on a team, you'll want to check out our business page, which offers a tour of the Pro Portal used to maximize your team's investment in training. Remember to check us out at itpro.tv/business. And we wanted to let you know on behalf of Don, myself, and everyone here at IT Pro in the Know, thanks for joining us. And until we see you again, take care.